The New Faith, Chapter 3. With David in the lead, Robert ran through twisting London streets until he thought his lungs would burst. David slowed down and Robert caught up with him. "Are you going home with me?" he panted. "Are there any Methodists there?" David asked with a flash of his old spirit. He grinned, sure of himself again. Was this the same David who had been so afraid only a few minutes ago? "No, there aren't any Methodists where I live," Robert said. Mrs. Babcock wasn't one, not the way she had shouted about Mother. At the courtyard, David stopped at the gate. "Who died here today?" "My mother." Once again, David changed. His eyes widened. "Aren't you afraid to go into the apartment now?" David's uncertainty made Robert bold. "Why should I be afraid?" It wasn't necessary to mention that if David had not been there, Robert would have stayed in the stable until Father returned. "We have to eat. There's a sack of oats inside. We can make some oatmeal for supper." Robert had a sudden memory of a loaf of bread he had bought. Where was it? He could not remember where, how, or when it had been jostled out of his arms by the crowd. It did not matter now. With David here, Robert was not afraid to go to the apartment. Later, after Robert and David had each finished 2 bowls of hot oatmeal, they sat before the fireplace. Robert thought of all that had happened the day. He had tried not to think of Mother. Much better to think about the Methodists and how much he hated them. "What do you know about them?" he asked. David pretended ignorance. "Who?" David's bland expression did not fool Robert. "The Methodists. You knew what I meant." "How would I know unless you speak out? Yes, I know all about them. My Uncle Jem told me." "What does the word mean?" Again Robert pretended he did not know what Robert meant. "What word?" he asked in mock innocence. Robert grew impatient. "You know what word I mean. Methodists." "Well," David began in a rush, then stopped, his face amusingly blank. "There are people who use, that is, they have a method." Method? Somehow the word had no meaning for Robert. It wasn't like a word like horse, cart, or bread, a word you could see, touch, or taste. "Well, it means they do things in a certain way." David was becoming annoyed. "What's the matter? You stupid or something?" "No, I just want to know what Methodist means." David sighed. "All right, then. I'll tell you what my Uncle Jem told me about them. He used to work for an Oxford man who was there when all this started. It was a holy club. Everyone had to get up at 4 and pray until 5, and then they would go out and help people." "I help Father," Robert said. "Is that a method?" "Of course not. You do it because you have to. Methodists do things for God." God was a word Robert did not want to hear. Nevertheless, something prompted his next question in spite of himself. "Do you believe in God?" David glared at Robert and sputtered, Well, yes, I suppose so. Don't you?" Taken aback, Robert tried to shift his thoughts. He had to believe that God who took Mother's life. How could he be the God who gave us life, the way the little man John Wesley had said? How could he believe in both? "Do you or don't you?" David was saying. "I guess I do believe in God," Robert said with reluctance. "I'm afraid not to," he added in a rush. "You ought to become a Methodist," David teased. "They're afraid too, my uncle says. That's why they sing and pray so much. Uncle Jem says he knows a man who wore a hole in the ground by a tree where he prayed so much. Methodists believe such crazy things. They thank God for everything that happens. And if someone doesn't pay back money he owes, you're supposed to give thanks. Or if you have nothing to eat but a leaf of lettuce, give thanks." Should I give thanks because Mother died? Robert thought. Never. Aloud he asked, "Why do Methodists believe such strange things?" "My uncle says they think God is more willing to do things for people that have allowed him to do, but they have to be more thankful first and then let him guide them." Somehow the idea of thankfulness stayed with Robert that night, even though he tried hard not to think about it. The next morning David shook Robert awake. "There's someone at the door. It's a man." The door opened. "Father!" Robert shouted, flinging himself into his father's arms. "How did you know about Mother?" Father said a strong inner urge had prompted him to return home. Friends had already met him and told him about Mother. Father brooded a moment. In a strange way, I already knew. He seemed to notice David for the first time. Who is your friend? David Elliott. I know a man named Elliott. Jem Elliott. He's my uncle. I bought some goods from him for my trip. Robert's head pounded with a sudden, sickening pulse. Father did not know the goods had been smuggled. He could be arrested. Should I tell him about Jem Elliott's arrest? David's warning glance told Robert to be careful. Can David stay here with us? He doesn't have a mother, and his uncle has gone away. Of course he can stay, as long as he likes. Father left to make the funeral arrangements. When he came back, Mrs. Babcock was from upstairs with him. She did not rant about the Methodist to Father. Robert noticed, but talked quietly about the funeral. Robert saw a change in Father. What could have happened? Mrs. Babcock seemed to notice too. You are so calm, Mr. Upton. How is it possible in the face of this terrible tragedy? Father motioned everyone to sit down. There was this little man, a gentleman, you could tell that soon enough, even though he wore his own hair instead of a wig. He was talking to some people when I was coming by, and there was something about the way he talked I can't forget. Such a strange thing it was. Do go on, Mrs. Babcock said. I can't shake off his words. He said, examine yourselves, whether you be in the faith, and he talked about the Apostle Paul saying, if any man be in Christ, he is a new creature. Old things have passed away. Behold, all things have become new. Robert listened, puzzled. He had never heard Father talk about such things before, but Robert could guess who the little man was. I would like to hear this man, Mrs. Babcock exclaimed. Who is he? I don't know. No one mentioned his name. It's John Wesley, Robert blurted. David looked at him in astonishment. Mrs. Babcock jumped up, her eyes blazing. What? So that's the man you heard. He's one of those false prophets spoken of in Scripture. How can you be taken in by the falsehoods he speaks? I'll not stay here and listen to another word. She bustled out, muttering her indignation. I have a good mind to report this, David thought he heard her say. Father had to take care of other details. He sent the boys to the blacksmith with the horse. Have him tighten her loose shoe, he told them. When the boys came back later than they had expected, Mrs. Babcock in the overhead apartment pushed open the shutters and leaned on the ledge with her folded arm. The look on her face told Robert she knew something he did not want to hear. David noticed it too. What is she up to? He whispered. Mrs. Babcock called down. Your father is not home. They took him away, they did, hardly a quarter of an hour away. The church clock had just struck. Took him away? Who? Where? The who is the law, and the where is the jail. Now he's with the other one. Robert echoed her again. The other one? Yes, the one they called Jem Elliott. Oh, I found out all about it, how the hearse hauled smuggled goods and how those sailors tipped it over and allowed justice to take place. Not only that, but justice caught up with your father. Serves him right. If he had stayed a junk man the way God intended, he wouldn't be in jail now. And Mrs. Babcock ducked her side and closed the shutters. David picked up a stone and started to throw it. Robert caught his arm. No, don't do that, David. It won't help. Nothing helped. Once again, burning thoughts of anger churned in Robert's mind. Why had God permitted this to happen? Father would not have knowingly bought smuggled goods. With Father in jail, what would he and David do? How would we live? On the streets like many other children? What if we were caught and put in the workhouse or the mills? After a supper of oatmeal, David said, It's just what Uncle Jem said. Those Methodists have started all the trouble. Robert could not see how Methodists had anything to do with Father being in jail, but he was ready to believe anything. How? He asked. Because they've made so many people dissatisfied, that's how. Going around praying, singing the way they do, it's enough to bother people. David straightened up. I almost forgot, he said in awe. Tonight's the night. Come on, let's get moving. The other boys will be there. Where are the kettles? For a second, Robert did not remember what David was talking about. Then he remembered David's scheme, jumped up and grabbed David's arm. Action. That's what Robert wanted. The Methodists were to blame, he tried to convince himself. If they had stayed home minding their own business, Mother would have never gone to their meetings and got drenched in the rain and fallen ill. None of these terrible things would have followed, and he would be home safe with mother and father right now. Robert led the way to the stable. He pounded one kettle after another with long battered spoons, trying them out for sound, until David told him to be quiet. "Wait till we get to Fetter Lane. Do you want Mrs. Babcock to hear us?" "No," Robert agreed. He helped David carry the kettles to the street. "I don't think she'll see us now that it's dark." At Fetter Lane, Robert and David waited for the other boys. Already the singing had begun across the street. "They'd better hurry," Robert grumbled. He was ready to make enough noise to raise the dead. He winced. He hadn't meant to think such words. What would Mother think if she were alive and knew what mischief he was up to? Oh, it was mischief, all right. Robert knew about right and wrong. He realized that. "Remember, it's against the law to have more than 5 people meeting together like this," David reminded him. "Uncle Jim told me all about it." The singing across the street became louder. It sounded vigorous and joyful. In spite of himself, Robert had to admit he did like it. The other boys came up one by one. David handed out kettles and spoons. "The minute they stop singing, we'll go across the street and start pounding on the kettles." Robert felt more and more uneasy. "What do you think they'll do?" "Well, they'll give up and go home. That's what my uncle says they ought to do. He says they ought to be chained up like the crazy people in Bedlam, or put in Newgate prison, and then taken to Tyburn and hanged." Once again assured that the Methodists were troublemakers, Robert waited for the signal. The singing stopped. David called, "Now!" He led the way across the street. The boys banged the iron kettles with all their might. "Run back and forth," David ordered. "Make them think there's an army out here." Robert pounded with every ounce of strength he had. He pounded out his hurt, his anger, his grief, his despair, his protest to the God who ran the world he did. Robert felt kind of delirious joy in seeing how much noise he could make. He'd pound all night long, or at least until something happened. Something did happen. There was a stir at the door of the meeting place. "They're coming out! Run!" David commanded. He was off in a flash, the other boys at his heels. Robert, still in a daze, was too slow. A man caught him by the collar. "Here's one of them." "Who is it?" someone called out. "Why, it's Robert Upton, the junk dealer's son," a woman gasped. Robert flinched. The word junk dealer sounded as if father were a criminal. Poor lad. His mother just died yesterday. Poor motherless boy. The pity was worse than the other scorn. "What are we going to do with him?" "Let Mr. Wesley handle it," someone suggested. The group parted. Robert looked up into the hurt, questioning eyes of John Wesley, the little man who had told him about God. "He remembers me," Robert realized. The disappointment in John Wesley's eyes went straight to Robert's heart. He had wronged the man who was only trying to help him understand God's ways. With a gasp of shame, Robert whirled, plunged through the circle of people, and for the second time in 2 days, ran away from the Methodists.